Welcome to Fine Line Station, where I read out letters and emails sent by you, the listeners. They are real life stories about the uncanny, the creepy, and the unknown. I am your host, Charlie Fox, and I hope you're ready to tune in. Today we have an email from Quinn where she shares an interesting quirk she's had since she was young, ending up in unexpected places. I'm sure quite a few of us can relate to the feeling of having our heads in the clouds, but I doubt we've experienced quite what she has. So with that, let's take a wander through Quinn's story. I was 10 years old when I got lost in my own backyard. Even an odd 20 years later, it's still a story my family brings up. One of those childhood stories your grandparents mention every time they see you and you just have to awkwardly nod along and laugh. And I get it, it's a pretty bizarre thing to happen. My childhood home was in the hills and we had a reasonably sized backyard and even a small creek running through our property into the next one. Our house was on a hill with the backyard going down, and so if you got to the very bottom, you wouldn't be able to see the door leading out. One spring afternoon, I was playing outside by myself, as I often did at that age. I was probably hunting for fairies or goblins, scouring through the partially filled creek as I turned over rocks and picked flowers. I was always into fairy tales, and they were some of the first books I ever learnt to read. Even now, I still love them. They hold such rich stories. As I would grow, I was especially fond of how the meanings changed over each retelling. Younger me read those lovely children books that were soft-worded and portrayed adventures with a happy ending. They were always illustrated beautifully too. So, I was outside pretending to be one of the adventurers I read about when I realised how hungry I was. Looking up, the sun was getting lower in the sky and it was starting to cool down. This next part is a tad odd and doesn't seem to line up with what my parents said, but I could have sworn I tried making my way up the hill. I'd pull my now dirty dress up and start climbing, but it's like no matter how far I went, I always ended back down by the creek. Eventually I gave up and crouched down by the grass and dirt. I couldn't help but tear up and thinking how I just wanted to go home. It wasn't until the sun fully set that my dad came out and found me. They'd heard the side laundry door slam shut and assumed I'd come inside and fallen asleep reading in my room, a very common occurrence for me over the weekends. They panicked when they couldn't find me though, and had even been yelling for me outside, but I hadn't heard them. Though I really should have been able to. Dad spotted me crouching down behind a large tree as he walked towards the creek and ran down to me, making sure I was okay. I wasn't injured or anything, just cold and afraid. I told them with a wobbly voice how I'd gotten lost and couldn't find my way home. As you'd expect, this worried them greatly. My parents took me to the doctor and explained what had happened with me. I'd had some other moments of getting easily lost and having poor memory before, but this was the final push to see someone. After a few tests to make sure it wasn't anything too sinister, the doctor gave me a clean bill of health but suggested I had some pretty intense spatial awareness issues along with poor short-term memory. ASD was also another potential, but I never ended up getting further tests. It was a bit stressful at first to deal with this realization, but the doctor gave me and my parents a bunch of things to help. There were so many we tried, but the ones I remember helping were structured routines, visual aids, and basically a heap of repetition. We even started doing memory games in the evenings to get me used to remembering things. I think it helped. Either way, those practices themselves turned into a routine and became an important part of my childhood and into my teenage years. However, I would still occasionally get really turned around and lost, and I'd often end up in places I didn't mean to be. This may be an excuse, but I feel like I just sometimes lived with my head in the clouds. No matter how much I was careful to create a map in my head and take visual clues, sometimes I was just thinking of too much other stuff that I didn't even register that I'd missed my turn, or walked past the shop I intended to visit. As I mentioned, I've always loved stories and adventures, and this passion only grew as I got older. I started writing my own stories in my head and coming up with various ideas. I never did much with them. Occasionally, I would write down a short story or film the odd video here and there, but for the most part, I enjoyed the planning more than actually doing. I find that sometimes when I go places, I almost go on autopilot mode. I know that tends to happen when you are familiar with a route, like walking from a train station to work early in the morning as you zone out, or when you usually follow a road all the way through and do that automatically instead of stopping halfway to visit a shop like you were meant to that day. Sometimes it feels like I'm not even seeing where I'm going. It's almost as if I'm seeing another image over the top of the real world, think double exposing film. I would just get super into my head and my ideas and not focus around me properly. Of course, this was a pretty dangerous habit to have. At least unfocused me was smart enough to stop to make sure no cars were coming and to not go down sketchy alleyways. But it was still unpleasant to suddenly realize I had no idea where I was. My parents made me carry a phone pretty early on so I could message them if I needed to. I remember the first time I was walking home from high school and ended up like 20 minutes away at a park. My parents were worried, of course, and decided picking me up after school, at least for the next little while, would be best. It's funny, actually. I feel like using "I got a little turned around" or "I didn't realize the time" are excuses a teenager would use when doing whatever teenagers did, but in my case, it was real and literal. Again, it's lucky my parents were aware of my issues early on, or that could have been a very annoying time for all of us. And so, that strange habit of mine continued on. Eventually, my parents had a little more faith in me as it became obvious I wasn't being reckless or going to get hurt, and as long as I called them if I ended up somewhere far away or removed from public places, they let me get back to walking to school and visiting friends. I graduated high school and went straight into working for a local cafe. I was a pretty average student. I had curated just enough habits to keep me focused on completing homework, but I had no desire to be a straight-A student or anything. I think my parents were disappointed I never considered university, but they never said anything about it. Either way, they were relatively happy as long as I was doing something. I kind of skipped around a few jobs after the cafe until I ended up working for my old school's library. My mum knew a lady who worked there, and I was lucky enough to help out when she went on maternity leave, and then after she came back, they ended up keeping me on. It's a good job, sometimes a little boring if it's quiet, and it can be frustrating to deal with rambunctious teens, but I like it. It's pretty tactile with organising everything, and then somewhat routine with inputting data, so it suits me well. I was really careful at first to absorb as many of the procedures as I could so I wouldn't mess up, and that effort seemed to pay off. The processes became instinctual shortly after, and I can half zone out without worrying too much about it affecting the quality of my work. Probably the weirdest place I ended up happened the day after I turned 25. I had a great party with friends on my birthday, then with mates after that. I was definitely feeling the hangover and still felt sleep deprived the next afternoon, but decided not to waste the sunny day and thought the fresh air would help me feel better. I threw on a button up, roughly did up my hair, and then made my way outside while sculling an iced coffee. Eventually, my headache subsided with some Panadol, and while I didn't have a specific place in mind, I craved a breakfast sandwich and decided to catch the bus into the city. I was still pretty out of it, so I guess I can blame that for getting off at an earlier stop near the business district instead of the town central. I remember nodding to the bus driver, walking down the bus stairs and taking a breath of fresh air. I started walking down the narrow streets and was trying to piece together a story I had shared to a friend the previous evening. The next thing I was fully aware of, I was sitting at a desk with several monitors around me, hands on a keyboard as a man in a blue suit was tensely questioning me. After a lot of back and forth, I eventually got the full story of what happened. Apparently, I had made my way into the main rooms of a local TV station office. I was dressed similarly enough that I had no trouble making my way to the elevators. You know that thing often used in shows where if you look confident enough and like you belong, people won't question you? I guess it was kind of like that. The main concern was how I got to the specific floor I ended up on. You needed a special key card to get to that level, and I certainly didn't have one. The obvious answer is that someone accidentally let me up, but the security footage showed no one but me walking into the elevator. I made my way up and went to one of the computer and monitor setups. There was nothing currently being filmed or produced in this section, so there was only the few workers milling around, but for whatever reason, none of them stopped me. More confidence, I guess. I turned on the computer and I guess someone had unfortunately stayed logged in, so I was able to access most of the applications. Then the guy in the blue suit, Jerry, had interrupted me as I was trying to download something. Yeah, it was as wild as it sounds. Honestly, I was freaked out. It was like I had walked into this situation without meaning to or any reason why. I had vague recollections of getting there, but they were like those half-formed memories when you're on the edge of sleep. I was panicked, but quickly came up with a half-lie. Luckily, I have some medical documentations on my phone about my awareness memory issues, mostly in case I ever got into an accident, but I was very glad to have them that day. I shared them and said I was there for an internship interview. I had simply gotten turned around while looking for the area I was meant to meet the employer, and I had conveniently forgotten their name. I continued by saying while I was waiting, I wanted to check my email and also download my forgotten resume. Okay, I probably overplayed my medical certificate and pulled a lot of it out of my ass, but hey, it kind of worked, and luckily it seemed I had placated them enough. They were still very unimpressed with me and told me I shouldn't bother trying for the internship, as they took security very seriously and sent me on my way. I still haven't told anyone about that time until now, even to my parents. I'm pretty embarrassed and guilty over ending up there and lying so much. And if I'm being truthful, it kind of scares me a little bit. I've had a few more moments since then, though I truly do try to be more careful nowadays. I've ended up in a few parks or antique shops I didn't mean to be at. Even last month, I was tired after a late night and accidentally ended up at an old used electronics shop instead of going home. Even coming across this podcast was an accident. I usually try to avoid music or podcasts unless I'm at home. Having an extra thing to distract me while out and about is something I generally avoid. I came home a few weeks ago to boot up a random talk show style podcast I zone out to while cleaning and saw that Fine Line Station had been downloaded. I must have downloaded it by accident at some point, but decided to listen to it anyways. I'm usually not one for creepy stuff or whatever, but I enjoy some of the more emotional episodes. I'm not sure how my story compares to the others, but I figure it's odd enough for you to enjoy. I'm sure I'll still end up in weird and unexpected places in the future, but for now, that's my story. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Thank you for sharing, Quinn. You were right in saying I would find it interesting. What a peculiar set of experiences you have had, especially with the TV station. I do wonder why you ended up there. You may not have meant it this way, but the way you described it makes it seem like you were like a puppet who was led there. Mind you, I have no idea why or by who, but a curious thought nonetheless. Oh, I also can't help but wonder what you were trying to download onto the station computer. Part of me wishes I could ask if you've had any more experiences with physically doing something you're unaware of instead of just ending up somewhere unexpected. Sorry. Of course, I won't ask for more. Thank you again very much, Quinn, for sharing your story. This has been another broadcast by Fine Line Station. I'm Charlie Fox, and I'll speak to you next time.